someone who's neurodivergent has a physiologically neural pathway differently aligned brain that functions in a way that's outside of the normal bell curve, atypical, neurospicy, neuroquick quirky. So it's physiological, which sets it apart from mental health things, which are more chemical. Anxiety is how you think, and the chemicals that flow when you're in a stress state. Depression is the lack of those chemicals. Then the endorphins and the dopamines and the norepinephrine, all those things those are more mental health issues.
This is the Turn Your Life Around podcast, and I'm the 180 Lady. I've been helping people turn their lives around since 2007 as the founder and CEO of a large mental health company. The purpose of this podcast is to have meaningful conversations with old friends and new friends, everyday people just like you and me, about how they turn their lives around. We'll discuss all things mental health, fitness, finances, relationships, parenting, spirituality, you name it. My hope is that you can take something away that will encourage you today. I'm your host, Sarah Coates. Are you ready to turn your life around? Hello, welcome to today's episode. We have some really great guests that we're going to chat with here in just a minute, but I want to thank you for taking time to join us and listen this morning or listen today, wherever you're listening from. We appreciate you finding the podcast, the Turn Your Life Around podcast. You know, we talk with people in our communities and beyond who are really making a difference, helping others turn their lives around or sharing their own stories about how they turned their life around. And so what we're going to talk about today, we have some really great guests, Jason and Debbie Grygla, who are joining us actually from Utah virtually, which is really great. And so we're going to talk with them in just a minute. I wanted to share a little bit about their background. Jason Grygla is a licensed mental health counselor of 20 plus years and the founder and executive director of NeuroDev, a mentoring program supporting autistic and neurodivergent young adults. Debbie Grygla is a certified parent coach specializing in helping parents of neurodivergent children, teens, and young adults. Together, they've dedicated their lives to providing practical tools, expert insights, and a compassionate approach that empowers families to foster growth, resilience, and connection. As hosts of the podcast Autism and Neurodiversity with Jason and Debbie, they share their personal and professional experiences to help others navigate challenges and embrace opportunities for growth. So thank you, Debbie and Jason, for joining.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to be here.
So thank you. And I'm really excited. First of all, thank you for joining us from Utah. I know it's early morning here on the East Coast. And so I appreciate you getting up even earlier to join me this morning.
Thank you for having us. This is so excited.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned
so
Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. So there's a little bit of a delay. So I'm going to slow my roll here. So go ahead, Jason.
You mentioned a podcast and our school that we run. The podcast is there to add value to a lot of families, actually all over the world, that don't have access to the latest information concerning their neurodivergent loved ones. And so our podcast is really a labor of love. And I think most parents will find it really helpful because it's all the things we didn't know or understand when we were parenting our own young adults that are neurodivergent. So I just want to make sure that's clear that the podcast is there for parents and families and therapists. And
I love that. It sounds like it's a great educational resource and tool for people to really learn and understand. So I want to talk more about that in just a few moments. And, you know, what we do here normally is when our guests have their own podcast or social media links or websites, we definitely link all of those links or put all those links in the show notes so our listeners can find you. And so I love that. We'll talk more. So tell me a little bit about you two and how you got started in the field of educating and coaching about neurodivergence.
Well, it started many, many years ago when we were a young married couple, super naive, and got the idea that it would be cool to be foster parents. and we hadn't been able to have children yet. We were struggling with a little bit of infertility issues, and Jason had grown up in a home where they had taken in nieces or nephews or kids that were struggling, and so we wanted to be foster parents, and we got into that, and over the years, fostered 6 and ended up adopting 3 of them, and they had lots of challenges and issues. Older kids, our 2 oldest were 7 and 8, then we later adopted we got a 3-year-old, adopted him when he was 5, and, abuse and neglect and all the hard, yucky stuff, but also in the mix of all of that was some diagnoses and things that came through, like ADHD, at least that was what we thought at first. Still ADHD, but also adding in their autism and learning challenges and things like that. And so kind of took us on a journey of understanding that more and what they were needing.
Yeah, if you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, it was always the same answer, a dad. That's all I wanted to be was a dad. And so I remember when we didn't have kids right away, we're like, well, let's do foster care. And I think they saw us coming a mile away and they're all suckers because we were young. There's no other kids in the home. We were energetic. We were willing. We were really naive. And I would say ignorant as well, but had everything we wanted as parents, all of our love and energy and passion for it. And so we ended up adopting 3 of them, and it's been a journey since then. There are 34, 33 now. 33 and 32 is our oldest, and then our middle adopted son is
Almost 23.
23. Yeah. And we do have 2 more little girls that are 17 and 13 now that we were able to have through in vitro. So the whole infertility journey is a different story. But we were blessed to have two little girls after we adopted the 3 boys. So attachment issues, trauma issues, they had been through the system. All of them had been abused and neglected and deprived and
bounced around from group home to foster home, group home, and us.
So a lot of their neurodivergency was hidden behind trauma or drug exposure. And so we assumed that trauma and neglect issues were more likely. And so we really didn't pick up on the autism. And
well, no one was talking about that back then either.
no, it was just ADHD.
Yeah.
Or you were level 3 autist at the time.
We're starting to talk about bipolar at the time, but it was, yeah.
I know.
But when there's these odd, quirky things that just were not changing or improving, and you start to go, this is weird. What the? Yeah.
And even as a therapist, I didn't catch on really until much later. And so a lot of parents I know, they kick themselves for not getting it right away and not seeing it, or I should have known, and I'm thinking, wow, I missed it because there was just a lot of pollution.
Well, there's a lot of stereotypes.
Pollution, yeah.
There were stereotypes. Our boys weren't fitting those stereotypes of what you think of as your classic autist.
Yeah.
Autistic.
Well,
so
just to mention, fast forwarding, I think attachment issues and trauma issues change the brain so much that is neurodiversity. And so it's not just autism, or ADHD. It's also anytime the brain is changed physiologically in a way that it impacts their lives.
Well, impacts their development.
Right.
It can stifle it or change it or.
So now you've got a developmental difference, usually a disability, not just a difference. So that's changing too. I think we're going to see a lot more diagnoses shift as well. Autism level 1 and ADHD are way more similar than autism level 1 and autism level 3. So anyway, there's going to be a lot more changes in the neurodivergent movement.
So, so already you're saying a few things that I think, let's just define or clarify a little bit. Maybe for some of the listeners who neurodivergence is a new term, they've heard of ADHD, they may even heard of autism, but they don't really understand exactly what neurodivergence means, especially if they're not in the school system as educators or in the therapy world like we are, or life coaches. So, share a little bit more about what does neurodivergence actually mean?
So there's 2 terms that kind of frame it. Neurodiversity is the term that we use to describe and acknowledge that there's different types of brain development and neurotypes. And then neurodivergent means that your brain development or your neurotype is outside the typical bell curve. So you're not like the most of the majority of the population.
Yeah, so a lot of people say I'm neurodiverse. Technically, it's I'm neurodivergent. Everyone's a part of neurodiversity, and that's being solidified now more than ever.
And then
Well, tell me more about that, Jason. What do you mean everyone's part of neurodiversity?
Well, the everyone has an ethnicity, so everyone is somehow racial, whether you're a minority or not is a different question. So everyone has a
Mhm,
brain. Someone who's neurodivergent
mhm.
has a physiologically neural pathway differently aligned brain that functions in a way that's outside of the normal bell curve, atypical, neurospicy, neuroquick quirky. So it's physiological, which sets it apart from mental health things, which are more chemical. Anxiety is how you think, and the chemicals that flow when you're in a stress state. Depression is the lack of those chemicals. Then the endorphins and the dopamines and the norepinephrine, all those things those are more mental health issues. So a lot of neurodivergent people with different brains physiologically end up with mental health issues, but they're totally different. And the problem is, and we'll probably get into more, is most people approach neurodivergent issues with mental health approaches, and that's been a big mistake. So that's where we
Yeah.
have really gotten to.
That's a valid point. I mean, as a licensed clinical mental health counselor myself, as you're talking, I'm reflecting on, yeah, it's still a DSM diagnosis, and so it's looked at as like a psychological disorder. And what you're saying is it's not necessarily a mental health condition. It is brain based.
Yeah. When you went to school, did you get much training on autism or ADHD?
Zero.
Yeah, 0, right?
A little ADHD. I mean, I was in school like 25, 30 years ago in grad school, but definitely a little ADHD we talked about, but probably zero on autism.
Yeah.
And my early career, I was a school counselor. And so certainly we had individuals that I was working with that were probably on the spectrum, were definitely probably to be identified as neurodivergent. But nobody was calling that at that time.
Mhm. Yeah, and they were approaching everything
Yeah.
from either an IEP approach, because that's what the schools do. They focus on education and
accommodations there.
accommodations,
Mhm.
which is their job and fine, but that's kind of the only thing they get is an IEP at the young age, and the parents usually don't get a ton of education at that point. The diagnoses aren't great because a lot of times the schools will push what is it called? The 4 instead of an IEP, they'll push
504
a
plan.
504 plan instead,
Oh, yeah.
and then they don't really
Hmm.
get a lot of good information about what's going on. And then fast forward 6 or 8 years, and their kid, because they're developmentally different, that's when they hit the mental health issues. 12, 13,
Hmm.
14, they're isolated, they're stressed, and then now they're depressed and anxious. And so now they have to
Yeah.
deal with, these 2 symptoms of being neurodivergent in a typical world, the square peg and the round hole that we talk about so much. And
Yeah.
then they do mental health approaches like counseling and
Yeah.
medication.
Coming at it from the mental health and still not addressing the needs of a neurodivergent in our society.
Yeah. So we feel like there's an
Right.
ocean
Right.
wave, this giant tidal wave of information and need coming down about neurodiversity. And I know it's a buzzword. Everyone wants to be neurodiverse now, it seems like, and that's fine. It'll be fine as well.
Mhm. I like, Debbie, how you described it like a bell curve. I mean, that really helps clarify and understand, like, there's a typical brain, a typical learning pattern, and it's kind of in a bell curve. I can just visualize it, and then the neurodivergence I'm understanding is the outlier, what's on the outside of the bell curve. So that's a great descriptor. So how were you able to identify this, or how did they come to diagnosis?
Well, we 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 were using the public services. They never were given, like, extensive psych evals. It was more like talk with a
Mm,
psychologist for 15 minutes, and you're like, "I think my kid has ADHD," and he's like, "Okay, we'll put put 'em on meds, and if they improve,
right.
then yeah, then it's working," right? And then there's still more problems, and we're ho honestly, the way we came to autism was my mom called me up one day, and she's like, Debbie, I've been watching Oprah.
Good old Oprah.
I think your son has Asperger's. That's what it was called at the time. And I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't know. Like, I looked at that and he didn't fit all the criteria. And then I went back and started looking it over again and saw it in a whole new light and realized they don't have to fit every single piece of the criteria to be under that diagnosis. And so that's when we started looking at, let's get an actual, like,
Yeah.
and pay the money and get a good psyche eval done.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
Well, we had to force a lot of things being in the system. We had to
Yeah.
fight for what we had. We were young, poor, and the kids were still a part of the state system. Not great services. So parents, we would go to a new doctor or a new psychiatrist or a new therapist often because we were looking for every resource. We knew almost immediately if they got it or not. And some
Mm.
people just don't get it, but they think they get it. And as parents, we quickly realized not all therapists and psychiatrists and med providers are equal. And the ones who got it were the ones who've either actually worked with them a lot or had a close family member that they either grew up with or a child um, that was neurodivergent, autistic, ADHD, nonverbal learning disorder, severe learning differences. So
And often we would take them to a therapist and, like, "I need help." They've got, like, anger issues, and then they'd start, like, telling me what to do as if I was the reason causing it when I'm like, "I just got
Mm.
years like, I'm part of the solution here. I need you to help me with them." And after a few sessions, "Their issues are above my ability to help you, so I'm gonna refer you to another one." And we went through that pattern, like, 3 or 4 times where and I
Mm.
would go to all the effort and go to this appointment, and they're like, "Oh, I'm not." So, at that point, you realize, "Okay, I've gotta figure this out on my own." Like, there is not support
Hmm.
for the level of issues that we were dealing with our boys, and
we also went through the naivety of thinking that if we have enough love and intervention and emotional connection, and my dad was a therapist and now I'm a young therapist, maybe we could just have them off their meds. And we didn't have them on
Mm.
their meds because when they came to us from a group home, they were zombies. And it really was.
Mm.
Like they had drugged them up just to manage them because they had 18 boys that were all out of control and energetic in this group home, and it was bad. So we took them off their meds, and after what?
oh.
Probably probably 4 months of hell, which was interesting. We finally realized it wasn't fair to them to not have them on their meds because they were destroying themselves. They were shooting themselves
Mm.
in their foot so badly that we realized,
Well,
okay, we're not above medications. We were pretty judgmental and young, I think.
the doctor's
Yeah.
like, "If your kid can't see the board, would you withhold glasses?"
Right.
You're like, "No, of course not."
Yeah.
So, if they're having a really hard time focusing and settling down, would you withhold medication that would help
Mhm.
them function in
Mhm.
school?
And so
Absolutely not.
the 2 points there are, 1, if you think your child might be neurodivergent, get a psych eval. Don't think it's gonna label them and put them in a box. It is so much more helpful to do early intervention, early understanding for parents. But if you don't know what's going on, so get a psych eval. Don't worry about whether it's gonna be a problem later or not. And 2, it's okay if medications help your child succeed and saves your family home life and even maybe your marriage. Because so many
Yeah.
couples fight over their kids because they love their kids.
Yeah. And well, and you just said something like, I think a lot of times what I hear, at least what I've heard over the years with parents in my practice, is they're afraid of labeling their kid. Like they don't want their kid to have a label. So then they don't want to have a diagnosis put in stone, or they don't want to get them evaluated. Or then they have stereotypes against medication. So they don't want to do that either. And I think at the root of that is in their head, you have a parent who expected that their child would be quote unquote normal. And I use that term loosely. What they really mean is neurotypical. And so they're having this grief process, this disappointment that a parent needs to come to terms with and say, hey, I'm disappointed it's going this way, instead of fighting what needs to be done for their child. And so I think that parents need to hear that as well. Like it's okay to feel a little bit of grief and disappointment that it's not going the way you thought it was going to go, but it's life, and let's just roll with the punches and do what's best for your child because you love them.
Yeah. And we're not like so pro meds that we want to drug them up either. If you can be off meds, great. Well, there's always the pros and cons to everything.
And we were still doing like making sure they were eating well and like cutting out, junky food as much as possible, not withholding, but we were doing that along with it. But the meds did make a difference for sure, especially with their level of
Anyway,
challenges.
what we learned is that none of the parenting books were working. They didn't fit kids with attachment and neurodevelopmentally different brains. So we were getting judged by our friends and probably our family. We were overwhelmed and at the end of our ropes a lot, exhausted. Nothing worked. We would have moments of manic, gleeful, blissful, energetic pleasure, but then this pendulum would always swing the other way and they would crash. And it just seemed to be, they did not have any emotional regulation, which is kind of the basis of what neurodiverse issues look like. Yes, anxiety and depression, but at the core of why they're depressed and anxious is that they don't fit in. And why they don't fit in is typically how their brains are working. And what we've learned is that they live often in their lower brain, their limbic brain. We call it the lower brain because it's easy.
Just the nervous system, threat response, and the emotional part of the brain and the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex that's responsible for executive functioning. If you have a kid with ADHD or these kinds of challenges, that prefrontal cortex is what actually regulates the lower parts of the brain. And if there's not good communication happening, if there's not good activity and electrical flow and blood flow and things happening in that executive prefrontal cortex area, that's where that's disabling. That's creating a lot of the challenges that they're having. And it's not their fault.
They end up living in their lower brain. And as it dysregulated. And the dysregulation is kind of a big piece. So we look at the developmental disabilities and there's so many factors. And I'm still, after 8 years of working just with this population, every week it seems like I get a new insight and understanding, like, oh, I didn't really understand that. And we're parents, which we learned way more as parents than I ever did as a therapist or a parent coach. So I think that's why we speak the language, is we're parents first.
So tell us more. What do you mean living in the lower brain versus the prefrontal executive functioning area? Explain that a little bit to the audience.
Right. And so when he's talking about living in the lower brain, meaning that living in a constant lower brain state, so living in a nervous system, that threat response activated kind of state where you're in kind of survival mode all the time. And so then what does that look like? Then how do kids act when they're anybody in a survival state? They're either in a fight response where they're more aggressive, combative, argumentative, defiant. We label these things bratty, like there's all these like judgmental labels, right? But that's a fight response trying to survive. Or they're the flight response where they're avoid it and get out of here and
on their devices.
And then a freeze response where they're just spinning in constant like analysis by paralysis and frozen up, can't make decisions, can't move forward. Or then what we dealt with a lot with, and any parents of adopted kids.
Or females especially.
Females, you've got the fawn response. So that's your people pleasing, you're lying, manipulating,
masking,
cheating, stealing.
Passive aggressive stuff.
To survive. It's not a morality issue. It's my brain does this to be able to survive.
The worst part about them living more in their lower brain than a neurotypical is that they're not accessing their higher brain, their frontal cortex as much. So they're not okay. They're not creating. They're not connecting.
They're not developing.
They're not thriving. They're just surviving. They're always just paddling in the water, trying to keep their nose up instead of swimming to get to a direction. And it is so hard as parents to watch. And none of that has anything to do with IQ. I think the downside is most of these kids were brilliant at certain things at a very young age. So the parents are like, oh, I hit the jackpot. This kid's amazing. Look what he's doing. He can memorize, or she can memorize, and they're so smart. And IQ has nothing to do with developmental disability usually, unless there's a intellectual disability, but that's a different thing. And so to tease that out, it's
And it
interesting.
throws you off if they have a higher IQ because you think, well, they should be able to.
Yeah,
Why aren't they
Do they
doing
know
this
what
way?
to do?
Yeah.
I think every time we work with kids, our immediate approach is, well, we just need to tell them what to do. They must not get it. But no, they know everything. They're very informed intellectually, and they can tell you all the things they're supposed to be doing. And so it's a totally different mindset working with neurodivergence.
Because just because you have intellectual knowledge doesn't mean you have applied skills.
I,
Very different
I think
things.
I think some people are pushing towards a neurodivergent affirming care, which is great. I agree. Affirming means you're okay. Take a breath.
Mm-hmm.
I want to affirm your strengths and also acknowledge your weaknesses. What they often don't do is do neurodivergent informed care, which means there really is disabilities there. And it's one thing to affirm them and say, hey, you don't have to mask ever. And just because whatever you feel like is great, because we want you to be okay with yourself. But like everybody has to mask sometimes. We have to put on
Mm-hmm.
a show at work. We have to brush our teeth if we want to go out in public. And so there's so many things that we're learning now that we didn't even know 5 years ago. Because we're
Well, when I think, sorry, Jason, I was going to say, when I think of like affirming care, I think of love and acceptance. Like, I love and accept you for who you are. But just like we were talking a minute ago with your kids, your adopted kids, with the medication, the evaluations, you were trying just to love them, but it wasn't helping, meaning it wasn't getting them from point A to point B. And I think it's the same with neuroaffirming care. We love and accept you for who you are and how you were created, but now I want to take the next step. And I think that's the part that a lot of people are missing. I agree. And I see that in the mental health world is the informed care. Like, what do you do next?
right.
So tell us a little bit more about what you all did next.
So when I was working as a therapist at a treatment center for teenage girls, I knew I had always wanted to open up my own practice or my own therapy treatment program, something to help people, but I didn't know what to do. It came down to about 10 years ago. My friend, one of my partners at NeuroDev, and I sat and he said, well, if you could open up any treatment program, what would you open? I said, honestly, I wouldn't do treatment at all. Well, I wouldn't do mental health. I would open up a place
Mm-hmm.
for neurodivergence, those who are autistic at the time. We didn't really say neurodivergent. We just said those who are autistic, Asperger's, a place for them to practice life and develop and grow. And then I talked about teenagers versus young adults. I thought, well, the need is where the young adults are. The services cliff is there. Let's do something for them. And let's sit down and decide what do they need. And let's see how much it costs and see if we can actually do that. And it's a very expensive, labor-intensive program because it's all mentoring, not medication providing, not just counseling three times a week or 2 times a week. They need constant mentors in the moment to do co-regulation, to connect and collaborate, which is what we do with our neurodevelopmental mentoring approach.
To get them out of their comfort zones and having new experiences and developing, but not to the point of being overwhelmed where they're getting emotionally dysregulated. So it's
Yeah, so fast forward, I have 3 partners, and we sat for a year every Tuesday night and just brainstormed about what to do and how to do it, and we decided to open up a school that was a post-secondary vocational school for young adults who were techies, because a lot of our kids tend towards engineering and tech, and anyway, we decided not to do a therapeutic approach at all because mental health issues for neurodivergence, if you focus on those are the symptoms. So
Yeah.
you can talk about depression all day long in therapy, but what therapists are finding and what we tried to do as a therapist was, how do we help them get friends where they belong? How do we help them
Mhm.
be emotionally regulated when they're not in session? Like we couldn't go with them as their wingman to get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, which is what they needed, or we couldn't go with them to be with their parents, who needed to create the environment for a regulated, emotional, meet your needs type of environment. So that's what we did, and we started to learn a lot. And eventually, our kids were getting jobs in tech, but they were getting fired. They would get hired for their
Mm.
strengths, but fired for their weaknesses. And everyone wants to focus on our loved ones' strengths, and that's great. I'm all for it. But the reason they were failing was the weakest links in the chain were kicking their butts. So we stopped working as much on getting them amazing at computer programming or IT, and we started focusing, okay, conflict resolution, emotional regulation, showing up, executive functioning skills,
Hygiene.
hygiene, community,
Mm.
all of the things that our students struggle with because developmentally they are delayed in their timeline by at least a few years. And
They're right on track for them, just compared to
Mm.
typical peers.
yeah, so
Right.
that's one of the issues, the shame that comes when they don't hit their milestones, their developmental timelines. When you have a developmental difference, a developmental disability, looking at it through a mental health lens is really not helpful. Insight-based therapies tend to teach them that you just can't take what you know and apply it, which means you're failing, and they walk away often thinking, "I can't even like, not even therapy fixed me." Our counseling communities have done an amazing job marketing therapy as the cure, but as a therapist, we know therapy doesn't fix anything. It's we help coach them and make decisions and have insight to go out and fix themselves throughout the rest of
Right.
the week and not Wednesdays at 2 o'clock. So anyway, we've shifted now to just developmental focus, which allows them to be successful at whatever they do instead of just providing a career path, which is where we started. The need shifted to development and growth. So that's how we are where we're at. NeuroDev is our new name. We used to be called Techie for Life. We were all techies, and now we're probably 30% techies. The rest are who knows what they're going to end up wanting to do and liking.
So, NeuroDev is the school that you started.
Mhm.
Yes. So tell us a little bit more about where that's located or locations.
Yeah, so NeuroDev started with the belief that if they, including our son, and our son was our first student, if
Mm.
our son had a place to belong, then his emotional manic I'm not okayness went way down, and he took a metaphorical breath and realized I'm okay, I have friends, and now I can start being in my higher brain and creating and learning and doing the things that we want adults to do. And so we started the school, and now we have 2 locations, 8 or 9 years later, one in Raleigh, North Carolina, and one in St. George, Utah. So kinda one on each coast is where we're at right now. And our focus is on development and literally changing their neural pathways, not just getting them to do their homework. Getting them to do their homework is important, but that's if you start with that, you typically miss a lot of important foundational pieces. So a behavioral approach or a performative approach where we just tell them to brush their teeth, their parents have already done that 1,000 times.
Mm.
They know to brush their teeth. They know to communicate. They know to not, I don't know, information dump when they get into a social situation, but they can't help it or they don't help it yet. I don't know what you would add to that.
Well, it's still mental health informed too. I wanted to add that because those are challenges that they're dealing with on top of it often. But it's taking that developmental approach where we want to first really support their emotional well-being and their basic needs, and for all adolescents and young adults to be able to go off and be independent and leave the nest, they've got to have peer acceptance. And parents, as much as we love them, we can't provide that. And so getting
Mhm.
that foundational need met, and as when they have a sense of well-being and there's a little bit more emotional regulation happening, that's when developmental leaps will happen. Then they have the capacity to take on challenges and be uncomfortable and try that new thing and, stick with it longer than they might have if they were already operating at a very stress level.
Yeah, and even when you approach it the right way, they're still gonna be 3 to 8 years behind their peers,
Neurotypical peers,
neurotypical
yeah.
peers in development and milestones, and that's okay. That's the part of neurodivergent affirming care that is so important is your developmental timeline is different. I really am expecting a 14-year-old to be doing, 19 or 20-year-old developmental typical things. Take a breath, mom and dad. You're okay. This is just gonna be a different ballgame. And information is really helpful if they can grasp that they really are different and it's not just willfulness and the shame that parents have to deal with because their child is falling behind, they're not doing it, they're not cutting it, they're taking all the time and energy. The shame on the kid whether they're, 26, they're still a kid for us. The shame and the embarrassment, they're aware enough to know they're not cutting it. And then they either pretend they don't care and say, well, I don't need that anyway. I don't need the date. I don't care about college. I don't need friends. Well, they're preemptively rejecting others. In some ways, it would be easier if they were just level 3 autist, where they were nonverbal and were so blissfully naive that they could just do what they wanted and never feel bad about stuff. But our kids feel bad about everything, and they're disabled enough to not be able to do everything they could about it yet. And I like the word yet. Not that neurodiversity
Yeah.
goes away, but maturity and development does happen. Milestones do happen. So we never thought our son would be dating or working or driving or living on his own. We thought he would just live with us forever. And he's doing all of those things. So
That's wonderful. So the school, the Utah and the Raleigh one, the locations, what ages, what gender, what is it, co-ed? Like, how does the whole logistical piece work?
Yeah, co-ed, and we can do 17. Some of it, they need that bridge from high school into college, and the supports have run out for them. So 17 to 30-ish, it's all about, are they a good fit? Are they going to be accepted into the peer group? And
in our schools, we have to have a pretty good balance of, are they high enough functioning to have a college experience, or are they just needing a long-term, lifelong group home type situation? And that's not what we do. We are
Right.
a 1-year typically program that gives them about 3 years of experience and development in that 1 year. And then we have a year-long assessment as well, where we can tell the parents, here's what they can do, here's what they're likely to be able to do, and here's what they are always going to struggle with, which is such a great assessment to know, okay, from here on out, this is
how do
what
I
we have
best
to do.
allocate, resources and plan for the future?
Because even when they come to us, if they're 19 or 20 and they get a year in, that gives them a huge shot boost in the arm where they can propel forward.
Like a big developmental boost of momentum.
Yeah, but they still aren't going to hit their stride until their mid to late 20s. Most neurodivergents don't hit their stride until their mid to late 20s. So mom and dad, there might not be a light at the end of the tunnel as they're, 10 to 15, but just because they turn 18 doesn't mean you're done. And that was a really big shocker for me, where I'm like, legally, I'm not responsible for him anymore. I can send him out. Then when it came down to it, I couldn't send him out. He wasn't ready. It was like sending a 14-year-old out to live on their own. And that was hard. I really was exhausted a lot. And there was not easy fixes. A lot of it's just labor intensive and emotionally intensive. So
So, okay, what I'm understanding is at the NeuroDev school, these kids maybe have already graduated high school, or
Yeah.
are almost graduation.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yep. And then they coming into your program for a year or so.
Yeah, we help them
Mhm.
finish high
Mhm.
school or help them start into college, and we do it. We slow everything down, give them a bigger on ramp,
Okay.
build those micro skills that maybe a neurotypical picks up quicker, and build those in. So helping them make that college transition. We've got lots of students that have failed out of college 2 and 3 times. We're able to help get them back in and having positive experience and developing the skills they need. We get some that already have a degree, but they can't bridge that transition into getting a job. And then we've had students that have a good job, but they have no life. They're depressed and lonely, and they're like, "What's the point of working if I don't have any, I have no life." And so then they come and we fill in those gaps. So kind of anywhere they're at in the process, we're able to look at what are they needing, what developmental gaps are missing, how can we support them moving forward on a viable path for them.
and just to speak to that, I think parents, when their kids in school, their big focus is, how do we get them to do well in school, as if that is development, and it's not. There's a lot of students that are great students but horrible at life, and then when they graduate high school, they tend to move right into, okay, how do we get them to do well in college? Because once they do well in college, they'll be able to succeed in life, but they're totally different skill sets. And we have students that can go to school really well, but they can't create anything outside of the school setting, or they're really great outside of the school setting, but they can't go to school. And it's all about assessing their personalities and their interests. But there's a lot of rigidity, a lot of learning differences, a lot of internal grieving that they haven't done yet. They don't have identities. Most of them have been through a lot of crap as juveniles, as adolescents, as teenagers. And when we get them as young adults, they can finally start to take a breath, especially if they can move away from home. Living at home, sometimes that's the only option, parents, and I get that. Because if you send them out to live somewhere else, they fall apart and they don't make it. But moving away from home is a huge part of just a typical developmental timeline, and it gives them such a boost to know I'm not still living at home, that they can relax and learn, okay, I'm okay. I got this. I can ride the bike. And then they can start connecting with others and in a way that's from their higher brain and not their lower survival brain.
It's really hard to make the transition into being a more independent adult, especially when you have needs, if you stay at home and you stay in a parent-child dynamic. And it's really hard when they stay
Mm.
at home for parents to step out of that very parenty, like, they've had to do so much. We were there too, like, so much to even get our kid to where they were at, but it's so hard to shift out of that mode and let them kind of flounder a little bit and have to figure out and take more responsibility for their own life. It's a hard shift to do when they stay at home. And so when if you're able to send them out and get them into a supported environment,
Go live with
makes a
grandma or
big
grandpa or an
difference.
aunt or an uncle, or a couple of friends nearby that they'll move in together. Always pretty good ideas. I think the biggest issue is if the young adult is still living at home, no matter whether the parents do everything right or not. The child is still in a mindset of, I'm still at home, I'm a child, and they stay in those ruts.
Yeah.
And then development doesn't occur. So it's such a hard thing to navigate. And every situation is very individualized. There's not a one size fits all. Generally, though, they have to learn to accept themselves, and they can't do that until they're out of their teens and out of the crises of the whole teen angst. So we build identities,
Mhm.
we build evidences that they're good enough, we build connections so that they can belong. And once they have attachment needs met, then everything else tends to go better. And it's hard to do that when they're still living at home because parents don't count anymore for am I good enough?
Yeah. This is fascinating what you have created. I think it's just so powerful. The word I keep thinking in my head is life skills. Like just teaching these young people practical life skills like you had talked about. How do you go on a date? Probably how do you order food? How do you, you know, um, sign up for an apartment, lease an apartment? How do you pay your bills? I mean, I'm assuming it's a lot of these kinds of life skills.
Yeah, and it's an approach of, you can teach a man to fish, they eat for a day, you know, or you give a man a
Yeah.
fish, they eat for a day, you teach a man to fish. Okay, you give him intellectual, like, information, but how do you really help them? You go fishing with them. And so in our program, it's let's do these
Hmm.
skills together. Let's actually, you know, go and do the shopping together and cooking together and
They need
live life.
mentors. They
And
don't need therapists or coaches or teachers or parents as much as they need a mentor. So our program's actually
Hmm.
called Parent to Mentors. We want the parents to shift their mindset to a mentor mindset, which is so much better for everyone, even the parents, if they can take off that parent responsibility, sense of shame, sense of grief, sense of I'm not okay if they're not okay. And there's so many things involved with shifting to a mentor, but that's really our advice to parents just listening is find a way to be your child's mentor, not just their parent,
Hmm.
because that's what parents do is what their child needs. What they need is emotionally regulated, connecting mentors to work with them when nothing else is working. Those things are working. It helps with co-regulation. It helps them feel like they're enough. And
it's respecting their autonomy, which they need to develop. Um, a sense of I have a choice and I have a life and I have, what I want to do. And then let me mentor you in that. Let me help you get to where you're wanting to go. Um,
yeah, but the teenage years are
Well,
a lot
and
of crises. It's hard.
hmm Yeah. And when I hear mentor versus parent, I'm thinking if I'm mentoring somebody and opening up their own private practice, right? Like I'm giving them guidance and advice, but if they do the wrong thing or they make a different choice, well, that's on you. That's what you decided to do. Versus a parent would probably come down as, you shouldn't have done that, and here's your punishment or your disciplinary action for doing that. So that's the way I see it versus mentor versus parent. Is that kind of on the right track?
Yes.
Yes.
Shift out of a behavioral
Mhm.
approach where there's a power differential and a hierarchy,
Yeah.
because that just keeps them in the child role, and then they never develop.
Mhm.
And if they didn't follow your advice and it doesn't work and you're like, "I'm so sorry. That must be like,"
Right.
right? You're there for them even in that. Like,
You
you
keep
tried to do that and it didn't work how you thought, and
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 it allows you to keep a relationship of influence, and
Mm.
that's way more important than whether or not they did the right thing, because we play the long game with developmental disabilities. How do you keep a relationship of influence beyond 16 and 20 years old? Because they're gonna pull away, which is developmentally appropriate, but they need you. So, presenting a safe mentor approach is really, looking at the long-term success and safety of your loved one.
Yeah, that's so good. So how do you know at your schools if someone's ready to complete their program or their time at your school? Like how do they know they've graduated?
so what we're looking for are the key things that we know are gonna help them be able to be more successfully independent when they leave our program. And those things are, number 1, having a sense of identity, right? And a sense of I'm okay. They need to learn how to self-advocate. They need to learn they need to know how to, like, we all need support people in our life. Nobody does life
Mm.
alone, and so being able to know, like, what I need help with and who to go to and where to get it, and to be able to do that
And
and
be
have
confident
practiced
enough,
that and
yeah.
show that I can come and advocate for myself and get things. So when they come in, we're going to them and we're heavily supporting, and then we're slowly backing off those supports, and then we're expecting them to come to us for what they're needing. And when they're able to do that, we know they're ready to go on. We're also looking for things like, um, building their emotional resilience, their stress tolerance, like,
Emotional regulation.
yeah.
We look at safety issues. Can they be taken advantage of? Can they take their medications pretty consistently?
Mm.
If not, what systems do we put into place? Can they cook? Can they do basic hygiene? Are they gonna burn down the house? Those are things that we've worked on, and we've had a lot of fires in our microwaves over the last 10 years or whatever, because they do something silly and forget the microwave or put it for 100 minutes instead of 5 minutes or 1 minute, and forget about it. But I think ultimately, we don't need them to know everything because they already come to us. Our kids come to us knowing everything. Why aren't they
Okay.
why aren't they applying it? Why don't they brush their teeth
Mhm.
when they know it's important? Well, they don't have friends or girlfriends to care. And why would I waste time doing something that I don't wanna do when I don't have a reason? I don't wanna learn how to drive the bus. I don't have anywhere to go. So a big part of our approach is how do we create a situation where they're attracted to, um, having a money plan for finances? Well, I've never had a job. Why are you teaching me about personal finances? And the first paycheck they get, instead of shutting them down and saying, "Hey, you're in debt. You've broken all these things at your parents' house. You need to pay them back for. You owe this person because you kept borrowing money," and we turn it into a negative. You finally have money, and we're gonna suck it all away. We reinforce the heck out of that and say, "What do you want to buy with your first paycheck?" We got students that are just excited to buy their first sword. Like, okay, I want them to love earning money, not learn to be responsible with their money immediately. So take it back a step and assume that they don't love earning money and they may not even see the point, especially if it's not fun to earn money, which a lot of them, it's not fun to earn money. We take a
Right.
developmental approach and it takes some time to see it through that lens. And every situation is different once you see it through an experiential developmental lens versus a what should you be doing lens.
And so looking for
Mhm.
those key things, then we know they're gonna have a much better experience and be more equipped to be able to, um, be more independent successfully. Probably still needing supports. Most of them do still need ongoing support, but we all do, right? So it's just how much, and
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. I keep thinking about the people I know in my circles who have older adolescents, maybe that age gap between graduating college and moving out on their own. And, they get labeled this term failure to thrive. They're living at home, they don't have a job or they can't keep a job. They're not in relationships and, they get labeled failure to thrive. And I'm keep thinking like, maybe these are some of the kids that were not even identified as neurodivergent. And
Yep.
so they need this extra support. And I love this idea of looking at it from a developmental approach. I think that's going to help a lot of parents kind of reorient to themselves about how they're approaching their kids. If someone's on the East Coast in the Raleigh area, which is where I'm at and where we have a lot of our listeners, how can they access your school and your services?
They can visit our website, neurodevmentoring.com. And we've got a contact form on there that they can fill out. They can also email get started at neurodevmentoring.com. And then it'll funnel to me. I do admissions and marketing stuff. And so then it's getting hooked up with which location and all in the process, seeing if their young person is a good fit for our program and giving them resources.
Any plans to open additional schools in other parts of the country?
Oh, there's lots of different plans, of course.
Yeah.
We don't think there's much like this out there, a place where kids can go and hang out and belong and be accepted without it being a treatment setting. So we're excited to put locations as many cities as we can without growing so fast that it becomes watered down. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is I don't want to use the term cutting edge, but I think this is really enlightening, just thinking about it through my mental health background and lens. I think what you're doing is just so valuable because the mental health community is missing the mark. And this is, I mean, what would you say percentage wise? What are the statistics now of like, young people identified as neurodivergent? Like what kind of percentage are we talking about? Do you have any stats on that?
it's shifting and growing and changing, but
I think it's 1 in 5.
well,
Mm-hmm.
1 in 60 are diagnosed with autism. But then you add
Mm-hmm.
ADHD, learning differences, and all of the other things that are neurodivergent. Um, and I don't know if it's 1 in 5. I'd say that's high. My guess would be more like 1 in 10, realistically. But
Yeah.
that's still
Mm-hmm.
significant. That's 10% of our whole school system.
I mean, it's hugely significant. So I have teenagers myself, and I'm going out on a limb here to say this, but I mean, I've looked at their peers, themselves, all this time through elementary, middle, and high school. And both of my kids learn differently, and they were raised by the same parents, right? And
Mhm.
so then I look at their peers and the little bit that I know about I'm like, everybody's neurodivergent. I mean, we all learn differently. We all experience life differently. Who says it's wrong or incorrect to, do this or that? And so I don't know. I think I just love this idea that, there's a place for all of these people to exist and everybody can achieve the end goal, which is hopefully living happily and successfully and thriving.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
this makes me think about too that that taking a developmental perspective helps all young people,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
the things that work for neurodivergence also work for everybody.
Right. Right.
It 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 really boils it down to what is when you have a kid that's struggling, you have to really hone it in, and those are the things that are effective and needed for all of our young people, and everybody does have their own unique experiences, and when you come at it from a, "Let me support each child's teen or young adult's development and their emotional well-being," you put those things together, and you're making a difference in their life. You're changing the trajectory of
Mm-hmm.
their life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One final thought or question for you both. At the beginning, you said, early intervention is key, which a lot of families, they are taught that if their child is diagnosed early on with autism spectrum or ADHD or whatever the deal is. Um, if someone cannot access one of your schools, but they have a kid that they're thinking, hey, my kid probably fits this mold. Like, what are 2 or 3 things that they can be doing themselves to help their child?
So the first thing would be we have shared everything that we do on our podcast to get that value out there, because we're parents first. We're not trying to market it or monetize it. And also on our website, we have free trainings to understand what to do and how to parent. We want everyone to have those trainings. We're not trying to hold it back. We love parenting. We love families. We love neurodivergence. We love development. And
Yes,
there.
we've taken our parent supports and we've opened it up to the general public. So we have a program for parents that they can join, and we do workshops and open coaching calls and ask a therapist, and our parenting to mentor course that's free, and that's at NDM. So it's based on our approach is neurodevelopmental mentoring, ndm.circle.so. So they can visit that and access some resources there. So I think it's a great starting point because I think it gives the lens of what's actually going on and how do you actually support well-being, and how do you and what do they need to be able to develop, and then from there you can go and access resources in your community and know what you're looking for, maybe have a more informed lens to kind of hone it in, because it can feel super overwhelming to try to even know what resources to access and who's going to be a good fit for your child and what you're needing. So yeah.
That's awesome. And Debbie, I know that I followed you on Instagram recently. Throw out your Instagram handle because I think you have really great parent coaching tips.
Oh, thank you. It's just Debbie at Debbie Grygla, which my last name's hard to spell. So it's DebbieGrygla is my Instagram. And yeah.
Yeah, we're always open to people emailing us and asking questions. We're parents first. If anyone calls or emails us, we can totally talk to them and let them know. It was so hard to find a community that understood what we were going through. All parenting's hard, but neurodivergents are different, and there's special hardness there. That's one of the reasons we created the circle. NDM circle is for parents to have a community to go get some catharsis and to be told it's okay that you were a helicopter parent. You had to be, and it's okay, and we'll figure it out together. So that's one of the reasons we started this online parenting, and also for therapists and teachers as well. It's for anyone working with neurodivergence that wants to be better mentors.
Wow. Well, my heartfelt thank you for what you are doing for our area in the Raleigh area, but just the community at large. I just think it's so impactful, especially knowing what we were just saying, like maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 10 individuals falls in this, neurodivergence category. So it's not an outlier thing. It's like, lots of people you're encountering, whether you're shopping in the grocery store, at the bank, or in school, at work, we're encountering individuals that are neurodivergent all the time. And so I think that we even just as regular adults need to understand more of how to interact with these citizens and, just show more love and acceptance and kindness, especially in understanding. So thank you very, very much for what you're doing. And, I appreciate you taking a few minutes this morning to jump on the podcast as well. We will link your links in our show notes so people can find you and find your Instagram and your podcast, and of course the circle, the community, and the schools as well. So thank you again for your time this morning.
Thanks, Sarah. Private.
And thanks so much for joining the podcast and listening in. If you like what you heard, give us a like, a follow, subscribe to our podcast, the Turn Your Life Around podcast. I love bringing these stories of what people are doing in the community to help others turn their lives around. We need it these days just to hear more encouragement and inspiration and help along the way. So thanks for listening. Hi, everyone. I appreciate you taking time to listen. These days we live in feel stressful, challenging, and maybe even chaotic. I'm really passionate about putting out positive content that will encourage and inspire others. I ask that you follow, subscribe, and even give us a 5-star review. Most of all, share this with your friends and family so together we can help people turn their lives around.